All right, just so you know, I'm looking at this, and we are right on schedule. Tomorrow, it'll be a lab day, as I mentioned, for you to work on all those hands-on exercises. And tomorrow, I will also go over for Chapter 4, and I guess there is a written for Chapter 5 also. I will go over test reviews for both of those, okay? And Thursday morning when we start, you will be taking a hands-on. Thursday morning we start, you'll be doing a written for Chapter 4. Friday, you'll do a written for Chapter 5. The hands-on test, which is on Chapters 4, 5, and 6, isn't for about another week. All right, and when we get to Chapter 6, if you look here, it says handout on CSS positioning. We haven't even gone over Chapter 6 yet, so don't worry about it. The point is, it says handout. There's 3 handouts, all right, which means that you aren't going to have to do any of the exercises for Chapter 6 that are in the book. Now, I just want you to know this. This may or may not mean anything to you, but because I'm trying to be totally transparent with you, that all of these assignments, the book, etc., were created by the person who started this program in St. Louis, Evan Gudmestedt, who's out there. So if you say, well, why aren't we doing the ones that are in the book? Because that's what Evan decided. All right. And I'm going along and getting along. In other words, I'm not trying to rock the boat. Do I think that he should do it that way? It doesn't matter, because that's the way we're doing it. But I will try to see if by tomorrow I can get you those exercises for Chapter 6, so you can at least start looking at them, so you'll have an idea of what it is you'll be working on when we get to that chapter. All right? Okay, so we're up to page 165. CSS special effects or visual effects. And the first one they discuss here is the background clip property. It says it confines the display of the background image. So in other words, what you can do is you can take an image and you can put it in its own little box. All right? And that's what they're showing here. And it looks like a lot of work, but again, notice that the name of this section is CSS3 Visual Effects. So you could use this, for instance, and maybe you've seen this before, where somebody literally puts an image within an image type of thing. So if you're doing things for special effects, that's what you might want to use. All right. There's the background origin property, which positions the image so you can position it inside of a box, however you want it to be set up. So if I wanted that image, notice they show them all the same, but I could put that image in any of the 4 corners, in the middle, or wherever I wanted it to go. The background size property, which is shown on the bottom of 166 and going on to 167, as it says, it can be used to resize or scale the background image. Sometimes you use something for a background image, and the image that you're using is so huge that you can't see very much of it for your background. It might be somebody's face, but it might have been a gigantic image to begin with. So you can use this as one way that you can use background size to get what you want. All right? And this is going to look different too, depending on the size of the media that you're looking at. In other words, a lot of these effects aren't going to look very good on my phone just because the resolution size isn't big enough, all right, that it's going to really mean that much to me. You can use multiple background images. In fact, if you look on page 168 in the book, you may or may not be able to tell when you take a look there, but what do we have here? We've got an image here, we've got an image here, we've got an image here, we've got an image there. All right? You will typically be using CSS to space those out where you want them to go. And it's not a big thing now, but you'll see this in Chapter 6. We'll be using the word float. So if you want to force something to go on the left-hand side or force it to go on the right-hand side, you typically use what's called a float to do that. There's other ways of doing it. We'll talk about some of those also. Now, on the bottom of page 168, and I do believe this is on your test, on the written test, know what this means. Progressive enhancement. All right? And there are two things. There's one that's called progressive enhancement, and there's another one that's called graceful degradation. So let me try to explain what both of them mean. All right? With progressive enhancement, what you suppose is that everybody using your website has the world's worst browser. Did you hear what I said? You literally are supposing that. So you build your website so that it will display okay even if somebody has a really, really crummy browser. All right? What that might mean is rather than having a lot of graphics and whatever, down at the bottom of each page, you might have hyperlinks to every other page, like a little mini sitemap or whatever. But then, so what you do is you build it almost as though you don't even have any CSS. You just give them bare bones. Then you say, well, if you've got a little bit better browser, and you put some stuff in the CSS. And if you've got even a better browser, and you put some more stuff in. All right? That means you're progressively enhancing it. So the better the browser, the better the viewing experience. Does that make sense? The opposite of that is what's called graceful degradation. You assume they have the best. All right? And then you break it down in case there's... So you assume they have the worst and you work your way up? Or do you assume they have the best and you work their way down? If you assume they have the worst and you work your way up, that's progressive enhancement. If you assume they have the best and you work down, that's graceful degradation. All right? That's a lot more than you probably would care to hear, but the point is that becomes a fairly important concept. All right? And there's a hands-on practice for that on pages 160 or on page 169. All right? Then turning up to 170, the author goes into talking about rounded corners. This is probably one of the most important properties there is, the border radius. When you want things to look rounded, you use border radius. All right? And the nice thing about making things look rounded is there's all sorts of things you can make look rounded. And when you do that and you make them look rounded, it's got a little nicer effect. It doesn't look so boxy that when everything is squared off. All right? And I probably should have mentioned this earlier. Do you see in your book on the very top of page 170, near the upper left-hand corner, you got this thing that says video note? All right? What that means is if you go out to the author's website, and we'll see where that is at the end of this chapter, she literally has mini videos that she created on some of these subjects that she considers to be important enough. So if you're not getting enough stuff from me, or you're thinking I rushed through this concept, you can go and look at her stuff on it. All right? All right, so here's an example of what rounded corners would look like. And just so you know, if you look up on the screen here, there are literally, would you agree there's 4 corners on this, and each one's rounded? There's a top left, a top right, a bottom left, and a bottom right. You can choose to put border radius on any or all of those. So if I wanted to, I could just put it in the upper left-hand corner. It might look a little strange, but you can do that if you want to. So there's, again, all sorts of different special effects that you can use with this stuff. In the hands-on practice 410, that's on pages 170, 171, and 172, you'll notice with this Lighthouse Bistro, you can see how they took the logo, which is the lighthouse, and the wordage, and they put it, and they gave it rounded corners. All right, so if you want some practice doing that, will you be asked to do that on your next test? Probably. All right, in some form or other. I've got to go back and look at the test. Evan has written a bunch. The first test that you took, he wrote that, but I rewrote it. There was stuff in there I didn't like. I didn't think he didn't do as good a job, I think, as I did of explaining like where you could find the color stuff and some of the other stuff. I just didn't like his verbiage, but the test was fine. So there's another hands-on practice on 171 and 172 and the top of 173. All right. Then going on to 172, they talk about box shadow. We looked at text shadow before. That was on your last test. That's shadowing the text. Box shadow is taking, and for example, right here, putting shadows on what's basically the box itself. All right, we're going to look at, that's what most of the rest of the chapter is about. As it says, you typically use it for things like divs. So it's not the text in there, it's what's holding the text. All right, and notice that there's different ways that you can use this. Horizontal, vertical, a blur, etc. Okay, this is probably not something you're going to work with a lot as you're first starting to create websites. But the more well-versed you get and the more professional you want your site to look, the better the chance you're going to use something like this. And again, there is a hands-on practice on 173 and 174 that goes through this. And another one on 175, 176, and 174, 75, and 76. Again, they go through this Lighthouse Bistro, and they'll do that in several chapters. They also have this kayak thing that's in here, and I guess they're not showing it in the book here, but it's in your book on the bottom of page 174. So again, I can't stress this to you too much. If you are running into any kind of trouble, all right, I would start by going through this. Okay? All right. The next thing they talk about in here is opacity, starting on the bottom of 176 and going on to 177. Notice it says the opacity property configures the amount of transparency. If you want something to be totally transparent, meaning you can't see it, it's 0. If you want it to be totally opaque, which means that it's all there and you can see all of it, it's 1. So if I want something, if I give it 0.5, it's semi-transparent and semi-opaque. Does that make sense? And if you look at the picture that's shown here, that is, they've played with the opacity. You can get marked different effects, when you work with opacity. And you can take anything you want and apply opacity to it. You could even take your image and apply opacity to it. Sometimes people do that. They do want a background image, but they want it to be very, very light and very muted. The problem is it's a dark image. So they take the opacity and they set the opacity up down to like 0.1 or something like that, where you can see it, but you can barely see it. All right. So again, the opacity property is supported by current versions of major browsers, i.e. 9 and later. It goes from 0, which is completely transparent, to 1, which is completely opaque, meaning there's no transparency. It says an important consideration with this is that the opacity applies both to the text and to the background. Okay? So there's a hands-on practice on 177 and 178 that goes through this. You'll notice there's a big difference if you look on the screen here with this, where they have worked and set some opacity, and this, there's no opacity there. See the difference? In the first one, it showed the image through there. In the second one, it didn't. And somebody asked before, like, which one's better, JPEG or PNG? Sometimes people ask, well, which is better? It depends on the effect that you're going for. It really does. All right. So again, 177 and 178 is another one of these. Then, starting on the bottom of 178 and going on to 179 with a practice on 180. RGBA color, fairly new. Red, green, blue, alpha. Alpha is the amount of transparency. RGB color does not use hex codes. All right? Instead, decimals colors are configured, and they show an example of this. Okay? You may or may not remember this if I go in and I use red. Red is also #FF 0, 0, 0, 0. Another way you can do that is RGB 255, 0, 0. All those mean red. Every one of those does. All right, if I want to put some transparency in there, I can add another, so I can do an RGBA, and I can put in, for example, 255, 0, 0, and then put in like 0.5. Then it's semi-transparent, semi-opaque. All right, and they show some examples of that on your screen here, and it's also shown in your book on page 179. So it says, and this is a kind of an important point on the bottom of 179. The author says here, how is using RGBA color different from using opacity? And as it says, opacity applies both to the background and the text. If you would like to specifically configure a semi-transparent background, you code the background color property with RGBA, or as we'll see in a minute, HSLA. All right, so again, all of this stuff in these sections are done for special effect. All right. Next is the CSS3 HSLA, and if you would look on your book, or in your book on page 181, you'll see this picture. It says, for many years, web designers have configured RGB color using either hex or decimal values. CSS3 introduced a new system called HSLA, based on a color wheel model. H is the amount of hue that's in there, S is the amount of saturation, L is the amount of lightness, A is the amount of alpha. As they mentioned, it's supported by more recent browsers. All right, so what's, fine. Then why would you use this one as opposed to the other one? Ideally, if you're using the color wheel, this literally has all 17 million colors in it. If you need to get if you need to get a certain color, it has to be this. What you might find is you can't find it using a hex code. You just can't get exactly what you're looking for. But if you use an HSLA, you may be able to get it. All right. That said, I don't ever use HSLA. I'm not going to lie to you, because I've always found that everything I want I can use using RGB, or just using the hexadecimal codes. All right. But they explain in here what hue and saturation and light are all about, and then they show you some examples. All right. So they show you red, they show you green, and you'll notice with all of these, the alpha is 1, meaning that they're totally opaque. They're not doing anything in here, all right, where they're doing anything with trying to make things transparent. And you look at this one and you might say, well, that's transparent. No, it's not. They're just playing with the color on there. All right. So they give you several different examples. I don't believe there's anything on your test that talks at all about HSLA. Again, if there is, I will let you know what it is before you take the test. All right. And the very last thing that is mentioned, the last thing that is mentioned in the chapter starting on page 183 are gradients. Okay? Anybody ever done anything, looked at software or seen it on a computer or on TV or wherever, where people morph? For example, let me see if this is still available. I don't know if it still is or not. I always love this because my kids, when they grew up, they were into Barney. And there was a morph where you morphed Barney into Hitler. Let's see, Hitler, Trump. I don't want to do that. I don't like Trump, but I won't do that to him. I don't see it on here anymore. But that back when Barney the dinosaur was really big, you could bring it up on your computer and you'd click a button, it would be Barney and his picture would change and he would eventually become Hitler. All right, so when you morph into a certain thing, you're going from one to the other. What does that have to do with anything? Gradients are the same way, but when you use gradients, typically you are morphing from one color, and I guess they don't show it in here, but they do in your book, to another color. If you look in the book on page 184, and again, it's not shown here, for whatever reason she didn't show it in this version. But if you look on page 184 at figures 445 and 446, you notice how the color changes. In the first example, it goes from basically a white to kind of a pink. And in the second example, it does as well. The difference is, in the first one, it's doing a gradient vertically. See how it's going down? In the second one, it's moving across the screen. So as they mention in the book, if you go back again to page 183, there are different types of gradients that you can use. A gradient, as they define on the top of page 183, is a smooth blending of shades from one color to another color. A CSS3 gradient background color is defined purely with CSS. No image file is needed. That's really important because since there's no image file needed, it's going to load much faster. All right. So on the middle of page 183, a linear gradient is a smooth blending of color in a single direction, like from top to bottom or left to right. Whereas a radial gradient is a smooth blending of color outward from a certain point in there. Very bottom of page 183, very bottom of the page. It is very important to keep progressive enhancement in mind when using CSS3 gradients. What they're saying in English there is not all browsers will support CSS gradients. So if you want to be sure, you'll have some kind of a fallback plan. Now, if I look on here, this is getting more and more where more and more browsers are supporting them. Did I tell you about this site, caniuse.com? If you go out to caniuse.com, now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type in gradients. And I'm going to hit enter. And it says 4 things found. You'll notice that typical gradients are supported by basically everybody now. Green means good. It means that it's supported. There might be some other stuff in here. Notice this. Conical gradients, which must be pretty new. Who supports it? Virtually no one does. All right? And this stuff is important to keep in mind. Here's a better example. So when you look in here, background blend mode. Anything that's red, so Edge doesn't support it. IE11 doesn't support it. Usually when it's muted color like this, it means it's semi-supported. All right, and green means that it is supported. The reason that becomes important is you have to write special things in your CSS to show this, and we'll get to that in the next chapter. All right. And that pretty much is it. I did want to show you, again, you will be doing the author's hands-on exercises on pages 188 and 189. On exercise 10 on page 189, the author tells you to go out to her site, which is http://webdevfoundations.net. So this is the author's site. Look familiar? You can come out there and all those little video lessons that she has where I showed you where they have the little icon for it, you can get them all from out here. She teaches at a college in Illinois, Terry Felk Morris. So I don't know if you think I have an accent or not, coming from Wisconsin as opposed to being here. But hers, I would say that if I do, then she does too. She teaches in Illinois. All right, at a college that's out there, and they've got earlier versions of the book, and there's a bunch of other stuff that's in here. All right, I've got author materials. there are some student files, and I think you can download those from here too. So notice there's chapter stuff. All right, so if I wanted any of her stuff from this chapter that we just went over, Chapter 4, I'd click here, and it's got resources and a bunch of other stuff. Okay? All right, what I think I'm going to do is I'll go till about 11:15 or so. So if I'd like you to turn up to Chapter 5, which is page 205 in your book, I'm going to stop taping and start up a brand new tape. So I'm going to stop this one.